Hello, this is Caleb Keith, director of the 1517 Podcast Network, with a message of thanks to you, our podcast listeners. During the month of June, we hosted a fundraiser with a goal of $150,000. Not only did we hit that goal, we exceeded it by $14,000, raising $164,000 this June. We couldn't have done it without your help, and it is extremely encouraging to see and to hear that our podcasts are having the impact that we intend, delivering the comfort of the gospel of Christ for the forgiveness of sins to listeners every single day of the week. And we appreciate your support because that tells us that we are on mission, that we are doing what we have set out to do, and that listeners are looking to support that and to help the podcast network keep those shows in development and actually keep expanding those shows onto new platforms. And so we greatly appreciate your support. Thank you for helping us out this June.
Welcome to another episode of 40 Minutes in the Old Testament. 40 Minutes in the Old Testament is a 1517 Podcast Network podcast. You can go to 1517.org/podcast and check out all the other podcasts that are living over there. While you're over there, make sure you check out everything else that 1517 is doing. You know what you could check out that 1517 is doing? Is sending some speakers over to, where are we going, Chad? Texas. That's right. We're going to Texas. Chad, of course, already in Texas. Not right now, actually. If you hear, when Chad starts talking, if his voice sounds different, it's because he's all the way in New Jersey, and he's in a different room, different setup. But normally Chad's in Texas, and then I'm gonna have to go out there, and Eric Sorensen from 30 Minutes in the New Testament is gonna have to go out there, and Kelsey Kilambar is gonna go out there, and Erica Sorensen is gonna go out there, and what are we gonna do? We're gonna do a little. There's gonna be a little conference going on about meeting Jesus. Now, you're not going to meet him there in the flesh, but we're going to be talking about all these different stories in the Bible of what happens when people encounter Christ. That is going to be happening in September. So you want to get tickets to that, there is a link in the show notes. And so you can sign up. And if you live in the Texas area, then you should come hang out with me and Chad and Eric and a whole bunch of other people and have a good time with us. All right. We are in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. We got through the first 6 verses and kind of ended with this interesting phrase that a handful of quietness is better than 2 handfuls of striving after the wind, better than 2 handfuls of toil. It's not going to get a whole lot more positive immediately, Chad. He doesn't. It's not like he finishes this particular chapter on like a real high note. It doesn't seem like.
No, I don't think so. In fact, there is a somewhat of a high note coming, I don't know, toward the end of chapter 5. But for those who are familiar with Ecclesiastes, there's not a lot of high moments in this book where they leave you, when you read the verse, and you're like, oh, that makes me feel really good. It's quite the opposite usually. So yeah, if I say, by the way, if I sound different, I am in beautiful Ocean Grove, New Jersey. It's a long way for a Texan to go, but we're out here teaching for a week. So good to be here, and but also good to be able to still get the podcast done.
Yeah.
So yeah, verse 7 is where we're at in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and we're going to hear about riches and whether they satisfy or not. We're going to hear some more about toil. We're going to hear about whether it's better to be by yourself or to have a companion. Maybe even better to have like 2 companions. So there's parts of this that sound I'll say slightly different than the tone of the rest of Ecclesiastes, because they're more proverbial in nature. We've already seen some of that, but so far we haven't seen tons of proverbial statements. We're going to see some of these in the section that's coming up next. So let me read 7 and 8. Again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. I've often thought about that. You take a guy who's maybe he has cut himself off from people, or maybe he just doesn't have any family. But this guy is like filthy rich. He's just doing all the things, working himself to the bone. And it's funny he says it this way, because I've actually asked myself the same kind of question. Like, does he ever stop and think, who am I doing this for?
Yeah.
What he mentioned, because it's one thing you can say, there's a guy who does this and he's like, well, I'm working so I can leave a legacy for my family. Well, yeah, good for you. Or I'm doing this so I can take care of my family or my friends, or I can support charities or whatever it might be. Well, at least even from a human perspective, you can say, well, that's a good goal. I can see why you're doing that. But if it's just all for me, and then, I'm going to die and ask myself, well, what was it for? So this is one more of these perspectives under the sun where uh, it's this limited perspective, which in this case is given by a specific example, which illustrates the fact that a life that is lived that way is not only unfulfilling, but ultimately it's foolish because there is no purpose to it.
Yeah, one of the things it does too is I've talked about this a little bit in recently, just in private conversations. But there's a thing that happens where if you don't have, so in this case, he talks about son, brother, somebody, right? These are all family kind of things. But I know people who have worked very hard, and sometimes this even happens with pastors and theologians as well. But it can obviously happen in the business world or in politics or whatever it is. And you meet people that have like terrible relationships with their children, or with their families, and they get older and older and older, and they've like worked to build whatever the thing is that they're building. And when it comes time for them to maybe like they would retire or step away or something like that, let it go, they can't because they have nothing to pour their energy into.
That's all they have.
It's
Yeah.
their entire world is revolved around this thing, and it's usually a very sad thing because you'll have someone in the last stages of life clinging to something that is obviously wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
They don't have children
It
around
was
and none of that stuff, and so it's a really sad thing. I mean, and I agree. This is a very unhappy business that you're engaging in.
Yeah, very, very unhappy in lots of different ways. And just it's that short-sighted view of life where you just kind of not thinking ahead. Maybe when you're younger, you devote your life to this and it becomes your passion, and you end up just kind of pushing everybody else out of your life. And in the end, it ends up being unsatisfying and really becomes what you just described. It's an idol.
Yeah.
You were bowing before the altar of whatever that thing is that gave you purpose and meaning. And in the end, all that it's the same with all idols. What do all idols do? Take, 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 and they don't give. That's one of the things of many things that distinguishes the true God is he gives, 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 gives. But all idols can do is take
Yeah, this is
and not
like
give you
that.
anything else.
This is that super offensive but biblical language. Of course, like he'll call, his people adulterers or whores, and he'll even go
Hmm.
so far as to say, like, well, actually, you're worse than a prostitute, right? Because
Yes. Yeah.
prostitutes get paid. And what he means by that is that you're like the worst kind of thing because like these gods that you're worshiping, they don't actually give you anything. Like you give them
Hmm.
everything and they give you nothing. So it isn't even like some kind of well thought out transactional relationship. No, this is a one-way thing.
Hmm. Yeah. Prostitutes who have to pay their own Johns,
Yeah.
basically, is what he accuses them of doing. Yeah. That's one of those graphic but unforgettable illustrations of what idols do.
Yeah.
All they know how to do is just take the life out of you and in its place give you absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
So he's established here that that kind of life is, of course, an unhappy business. So he's going to use the next three verses to give a perspective on, what's better. Is it better to be alone or better to be with people? And it begins this way: two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. So, I mean, these are somewhat parallel. They're just kind of illustrating various ways in which not being alone, but having at least one other companion is the better way to go, even from an under the sun kind of perspective. If you're working together with somebody else, there's a good reward for your toil. If something happens to you, and that's illustrated here by someone falling down, well, if you fall down, then the other person can give you a hand and help you back up. Or if you're cold, and then two people are much better at keeping warm, then you can use the body heat of somebody else. Now, the end of this, verse 12, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. That's, I don't know about you, Dan, but it seems like I've heard that used a lot in wedding services.
Yeah.
For kind of the key text. And if the listeners are thinking, well, yeah, that was used in my wedding service. Well, I understand why it was. I mean, it is. In the proverbial sense, it makes sense. In the contextual sense, it's not talking about marriage.
And
It's usually used in the sense of a husband, wife, and God as the threefold cord.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's weird about it is that, yes, so in your wedding, it's two people, God, three people. There you go, three persons. Hard to break that cord. In this context, actually, it's a kind of a weird thing to say because he's like, hey, two are better than one. If you fall down, someone pick you up. If you're cold at night, you can get some body heat going on. And then he says, hey, if you got a man that might attack you, if you got somebody with you, you have a better chance. If someone jumps me, it's a better chance that I win if someone jumps me and Chad. We team up on him. And then he says, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And you're like, three? I mean, this whole time you've been talking about two. And so
yeah.
I think that the idea here is that twofold cords aren't a thing. So a threefold cord is would be like the most common cord, I would assume, especially for that day. So you can't really. I mean, a twofold cord. I don't even know if that's a thing, Chad.
It'd be pretty hard to pull off. Yeah, you need three to braid together.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's maybe I'm just thinking about this because I've written frequently and done some videos in the last couple months over verses taken out of context.
Mm-hmm.
And how they kind of take on a life of their own. And when you look at them in the original context, you're like, wait, that doesn't really mean anything in connection with how we ordinarily use that verse. And I think this is the case.
I mean, do you even think he's talking about God when he adds like a third? I don't think he is.
Oh, I don't think he is. Because I mean, God isn't part of this context. Yeah. I think he's here. I mean, at the very least, he's saying, listen, if having one companion, so there's two of you, is good. Well, let me tell you what's even better: having two companions, so there's three of you. So you can keep warm, you can help each other up, whatever it might be. It's either that or simply saying, yeah, a threefold cord. Well, of course, there's not twofold cords. Those don't. I don't know how you'd even keep the two cords together. So
yeah. So yeah, I think it's just a thing that people acknowledge that like a cord is not as strong as a woven cord.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. See how it is. It's. What does that mean? Strength in numbers. That's what it means. 2, 3, whatever. Yeah. The more you got, the better it is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of an expansion on that earlier section, which was largely negative about the foolish, unhappy life where you're just by yourself. And then with accenting the superior life that has some companions with you.
Yeah.
So he's going to end this chapter, verses 13 through 16, by it's going to end negatively with more vanity and striving after the wind. He's going to kind of set up a story here. It's a very brief story, but a story nonetheless to illustrate something he's talked about quite a bit, to where something is better than something else, but in the end, all is still vanity. So here's how it goes. And it's a little bit confusing here, so I'll try and explain what I think anyway is going on here with some of the references to him and his in the story. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. That could also be translated, who no longer knew how to heed a warning or heed an admonition. That's often how that Hebrew word is used in other contexts. But take advice or heed a warning, this old and foolish king. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. Come back to that in a second, who these he's and his. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely all this also is vanity and striving after the wind. So here's a common frustration of anyone who works with the Hebrew. It's infamous for having pronouns where you're unclear about the antecedents of those pronouns. So there'll be a reference to him or he or his, and you have to ask yourself, okay, is this talking about this he or that he, this him or that him? Because we have two characters here, right? We've got a poor and wise youth, we have an old and foolish king. So when it says that he went from prison to the throne and in his own kingdom, he had been born, who's this talking about? I think, and I've checked the commentaries and they're divided on this too, but I think what's going on here is, so the old and foolish king that he introduces right away was once a young guy, of course, and he went from a prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. And then eventually he's replaced by this poor and wise youth. So the youth who then later stood in the king's place. So you got an old and foolish king who, when he was younger, born poor, and then he rose to the ranks, he became a king. Well, eventually he becomes old and foolish. He's no longer heeding admonitions. He's probably not listening to advice. He's kind of stuck in his ways. He's not politically astute anymore.
That doesn't happen.
So then this poor and wise youth comes up and takes his place. But in the end, he says, those who come later, they're not even going to rejoice in this poor and wise youth who became the king. So he says, all of this also is vanity and striving after the wind. This is more of the kind of a generation comes, a generation goes. A king comes, he's replaced. He is replaced by other kings. In the end, you're forgotten. That's the perspective of life under the sun. Anyway, that's the way I'm taking this.
It's also this thing where if you really want something, or if you really gain something and you're really successful, like it's very difficult. You have to be very assertive in your quest to have this not radically change you. So yeah, you could be like born poor and I don't know, be in prison for some reason, and then work your way out of that and become king. And what do you end up being? Like, I don't know, some old king that forgets where he came from and doesn't listen to anybody anymore. And you're like, you see that sort of thing happen. Like somebody was talking about, righteous kings and this kind of thing, which like hardly ever exist. And what you see, even with pinnacle king and someone like David, is that, yeah, like when David's a shepherd, he's awesome. And when he's like out there like slaying Goliath and everyone's like, that guy's too big to kill. And David's like, that guy's too big to miss. And he's just like, he's awesome, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And then when Saul's pursuing him and he's like, has all this respect for the Lord's anointed and won't touch him, and he's awesome. Like he's writing
some awesome psalms too when he's out there.
Yeah, writing awesome psalms. When Saul finally does die, he's mourning and killing the guys that are taking credit for it and all this stuff. And you're like, man, this guy is gonna be the best. And what do you see? Like, I don't know. He gets the power, and it's all downhill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's how it goes.
And you could come up with a million stories like that throughout world history. I mean, we can come up with personal stories, where it's happened to us or it's been somebody close to us. We've seen this happen. There's something about when you're still struggling, before you've reached that place that you think is going to be it for you, when you're still struggling, and maybe you're struggling from, persecution like David did, or at least you're fighting, you're struggling, you're probably in the best place you're ever going to be. Because once you reach that goal, then it's way too easy to become like David did. Kind of, you're not just complacent, but old and foolish, as it says here in Ecclesiastes.
Yeah,
Better to still be struggling.
Yeah, peak righteous David is David on the run from Saul.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. Because we covered this in the podcast. Once you get past the Bathsheba Uriah debacle, it is all downhill.
Yep.
I mean, not all downhill. There are no we're going uphill for a short time. No, it's just like it's all downhill from there. So yeah, I mean, it is just a characteristic of humanity, fallen humanity, that we do best when we have to still fight and struggle and don't actually reach that pinnacle, because it's way too easy for us to cave to temptation or become complacent or just become old and foolish like the king who's described here.
So it turns out all that striving for that is also a vanity.
Yeah, it's all hevel and a striving after the wind. So on that positive note, we end chapter 4, and we're gonna go into chapter 5, and this starts out a little bit different. This is not what I would have expected Koheleth to do when he is transitioning from that to what he talks about next. He's actually talking about going before God and praying and offering vows and things of that nature. So it's a little bit different section of Ecclesiastes, but we do have to read it in the context of the whole tenor of Ecclesiastes. I think I'll read the first 7 verses, because all of these are talking about being before God and what you should and you shouldn't do. And they echo one another, especially verses 3 and verse 7. So it begins this way. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes with much busyness, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin. I think literally in the Hebrew that is lead your flesh into sin, but used here in the sense of your person, you into sin. And do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one you must fear. I think that the best summary of that entire section is to when you appear before God, let your words be few and your fear of him be great. I think that's a pretty fair assessment of the whole tenor of that. I mean, there's a lot of details there, but both of these sections tend to echo that same kind of approach to God. So guard your steps. Just the idea, be careful. Watch what you're doing, we might say, when you go to the house of God, which in this case would be the temple, if we're thinking of Solomon's time. It's better, he says, to just go there to listen than to offer what he calls the sacrifice of fools. Now, he doesn't say what the sacrifice of fools is in that sentence, but I think in this entire section, the sacrifice of fools would be the kind of sacrifice that is described in the second verse, where he talks about those who are rash with their mouth and they hastily utter a word before God and kind of give voice to the dreams that they have. So he's saying that if you go to God just spewing forth a lot of words, doing so in an unthinking sort of way, speaking rashly, just kind of whatever your dreams are, whatever words just pop into your from your heart into your mouth, then that's going to lead you astray. Better just to go there and to listen than to act in that foolish sort of way.
Yeah, I think that you have to sort of interpret the kind of person that he's talking about, right? So, on one hand, and we've said this a ton, you can go say anything to God. If you're suffering or if you're struggling, if you're angry, like you can go just say whatever you want to him. We have lots of illustrations of this in Scripture. I don't think that's at all what's being talked about here. This is talking about somebody that would approach God with like hubris and arrogance. That you would walk in and be like, God is going to be really interested in what I have to say. Maybe I could tell him something he doesn't know. Maybe I could make promises and vows, even though I'm a notorious promise and oath breaker. This kind of person, the person that would approach God in a way like a fool, that says, I've got these great things to say. God is going to be so pleased with what I have to say. Probably put me in the front of the line next time after he hears what I have to say. And I think it's that kind of thing where there's a tremendous lack of humility in the way that you would approach God. I think that's very different than the person that would approach God and be angry with God or upset about something. That's different than approaching God and forgetting your place. And I think that's why it talks about the fear of God, that you would go in and think that maybe you and God are a little more alike than you ought.
Yeah, that's why he has the line, God is in heaven and you are on earth.
Yes.
Yeah, it's that. Yeah, we have talked about that a lot. The sense of lamenting and being honest and open with God, and that's where, yes, you do want to be honest, but you also, at the same time, you don't want to blaspheme, right?
Mhm.
You want to be honest, but not speak with hubris, not speak with disrespect, not speak as if you're talking to your drinking buddy, as it were. I mean, you're talking to God, who is in heaven, and you are on earth. So it's approaching with honesty, but also humility,
Right.
with a forthrightness, but not just kind of a vain boasting or a vain multiplication of words when you're before God. Now, the second part in verse 4 is much more connected to kind of this Old Testament making of vows, which was a pretty common thing that people did in the Old Testament. There's all sorts of vows that are made by individuals and sometimes by groups of individuals in the Old Testament. So he's basically saying, listen, if you vow a vow to God, and if you say to him, I am going to do this, then you can't come back later and say, oh, I didn't mean to say that. It was a mistake, or I've changed my mind. It doesn't work that way. All right, things just things change, and so I'm not able to fulfill my vow now. And the message of this section, and in fact, the message of other sections of the Old Testament, such as Deuteronomy 21, which says, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you. So he's saying, listen, if you're going to vow about a God, then you have to do it. There are no extenuating circumstances, in other words, where you can kind of back out of this or say to God, I didn't mean that.
This is why I've taken verse 5 and just like applied it to my life, how I'm going to live.
Better not to vow. Yeah,
I'm taking this
true.
very seriously. Like I'm not gonna make any promises. Okay, can't break promises that I don't make.
Which is a very not only common sense approach, but also biblical approach as well. Better not to make the vows than to make one and not pay it. And there's a risk too. This is probably a pretty common temptation for those who make vows to think transactionally. I'm going to do this for God. If He does this for me, I'm going to give Him this, and He's going to give me that. And that kind of view easily kind of perverts God and tries to manipulate him into doing what you want. It basically borders on magic. I mean, the difference between magic and the way that the Bible works is by magic, you manipulate God or God or the gods or the spirits or whatever you believe into doing what you want. So if you utter this potion or utter this statement, or you you do this thing, you make the sacrifice, then the spiritual force to whom you do this is obligated, as it were, to do what you said. And it doesn't work that way with God. The vows are mainly ways in which you express gratitude, thanksgiving for what God has done to you. One other thing here, verse 6, let not your mouth lead you into sin. Do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. I think there are some translations which will render that as angel. In Hebrew, it is malach, which we've encountered, of course, tons of times. But there's human messengers as well. Humans are referred to as a malach. In fact, Malachi references the priest. Malachi 2:7 references a priest being called a messenger. This is probably a case where you vowed a vow, and the priest or his messenger comes to you to say you need to fulfill this, and you can't simply say then, "Oh, I messed up. I didn't mean to say that. It was a mistake." You can't unvow your vows. Once you've spoken your vow, then the vow is obligatory, no matter what.
I think this is why Jesus, says, "Hey, oaths are like generally kind of a bad idea," and so maybe just be like, maybe just your yes is yes and your no is no,
and your no is no. Yeah,
and maybe just
very
kind of
Sermon on the Mount stuff.
Yeah, and maybe just kind of be the kind of person that doesn't have to take an oath because your yes means that you're going to do it, and your no means that you're not.
Yeah, I'm with you though. I don't vow vows to God because I know who I am as a sinner, and so there's a high likelihood of me breaking those vows. So better not to do that. Better to stick with God's promises than making promises to God. Okay, picking up here with verse 8, and here we're going to have a lot of talk. So get your wallets out because there's a lot of talk about money in these next few sections. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. I don't know who is tuned into politics at all, but maybe some people would be shocked by violations of justice and righteousness. But he says, don't be amazed at that, because the high official is watched over by a higher still, and there are yet higher ones over them. So that's verse 8. And then we have verse 9, which is a little bit strange, but I think maybe I can explain it. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. Strange. So let me read you some other translations. So this one says, this is gain for land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. NIV has, the increase from the land is taken by all. The king himself profits from the fields, which sounds completely different. New Revised Standard Versions, but all things considered, this is an advantage for a land, a king for a plowed field. Now that even makes less sense to me. And the New American Standard is, after all, the king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. Okay, none of these really make any sense to me, but I think this is what it's talking about. So first of all, he introduces the view of injustice, of unrighteousness. And he says, don't be surprised at this. If you're looking at a province or a country or a state, or in our cases, a city, and all of a sudden you spot some injustice or you see some violations of righteousness, don't be shocked by this. I can't believe anybody's shocked by any sin, but I guess some people still are. But don't be surprised by this, because it turns out there's a hierarchy here. You got high officials, you got still higher officials. And given the negative tenor of this verse, I think he's saying, listen, this one is trying to take from that one, and this one's trying to cover up somebody else's crime because they're buddies or whatever it might be. He says, let me tell you what's even better. What's an advantage for a land is when the ruler is at least committed to making sure that the land is able to produce crops that can feed the people. That he's committed, at least, even though there's injustice, even though there's unrighteousness, at least if you have a leader who is looking out for kind of the bare essentials of the land, that it produces enough to where people can get fed, even though you have maybe gross or at least minor injustice taking place at the same time. That's the best anyway that I can explain that that verse. It's a bit ambiguous even in the Hebrew, and so that leads to all kinds of translations and all kinds of interpretations of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is difficult, but it does seem like, yep, like rulers are going to be corrupt. They're going to oppress the poor. They're going to violate justice. Um, Kind of the best you could hope for is that while that's going on, that they're taking care of like the thing that they're supposed to, the base level thing that they're supposed to be committed to, which is like in this case, do you have food? Like, is the land
Mm-hmm.
are the fields being plowed and yielding forth crops like that? And sort of this is just how I read it. You shouldn't expect more than that from them because like the rest of it is probably going to be corrupt and not like you're going to find all kinds of things to be frustrated about. Like if you can find this king who is at least taking care of that, regardless of whatever else is going on, you've pretty much got the best you could hope for in a king.
And these verses have quite summarily wrapped up my view of politics in just a few verses.
Well, you know, it's
I,
when the people are starving to death. That's when you get the revolt. You know.
That's when there's issues. Yeah, I expect injustice. I expect unrighteousness because it turns out, every official is a sinner, and it's extremely hard to get people in any kind of office, city level, state level, national level, whatever it is, who are always going to be looking out for the best interest of others. Because, I mean, and I'm not like throwing stones at others. I'm the exact same way.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a realistic view of humanity. So at the bare minimum, let's be thankful if the country is producing enough food so that people can eat, have full stomachs when they go to bed at night. So that's 10 through 12. Verse 13 he shifts to riches. He says, "There's a grievous evil that I've seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and to make matters worse, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. Maybe it was a bad business deal. Maybe it was an investment that fell apart. Maybe it was gambling. Who knows what it was? But anyway, the riches were lost. He kept them. They were kept to his own hurt, and they were lost in this bad venture. And to make matters even worse, he's the father of a son who's got a kid, but he has nothing in his hand. And I'm assuming that means either he has nothing in his hand to feed the child, or maybe nothing to give to his son as an inheritance, whatever it might be. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again. Naked as he came. That's very Job-like language, right? Naked I came from my mother's womb. Naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, the Lord is taken away. So naked as he came, naked shall he go there, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? And moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger." So here you have a guy who, he was rich, but he lost everything. Couldn't take for his kids. He's you get the image in that last verse of eating in darkness with vexation and sickness and anger, like everything's fallen apart. He's cut off from others. He's sitting in the darkness. He's vexed. His health is deteriorated. He's upset because of the situation in which he finds himself, the situation that he himself has created. And Kohelet calls this a grievous evil under the sun. Well, yeah, of course, because this guy probably thought that the riches that he had were going to be his salvation. He put his trust in those. Well, they were lost. And what's he left with? He was left with the same thing that we're always left with when we put our worship, our trust, our love in something other than God, something more than God. We're left in the darkness with vexation and sickness and anger.
Yeah, I mean, this one is not too hard to explain. You're like, yeah, this guy has held on to these things. In other words, like made these things his life, and then lost them, and now you have nothing. So you have invested poorly. It's not just that he invested his money poorly; he invested his life poorly.
His life poorly, yeah. So this is what's good. Behold, what I've seen to be good and fitting. So we have a lot of bad, but this is good and fitting. To eat and drink and to find enjoyment. to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil. This is the gift of God. For he will not remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. This is one of these sections in Ecclesiastes that stands out, because it's not dark, it's bright. It's not, warning of this evil or that evil. It's like, this is good. So eat, drink, and find enjoyment in God's gifts. If you have wealth, if you have possessions and power, that's fine. These are the lot that God has given to you. It's his gift. And if you live a life in service to him, in love toward him, in service to your neighbor, then God is going to occupy your heart with joy, so that you're focused upon that which is good, that which God has given you to do, instead of all these other scenarios that he has painted in the previous verses, where you find yourself just with nothing but despair and loss and frustration because you have been devoting your life to a false God.
Yeah, the secret of life is contentment, right? This seems kind of what Solomon is saying here. Like wherever you end up, whatever it is that God gives you, you'll be much happier. In fact, you might find that your days are lost in joy if you can figure out how to be content with what you have.
Yeah, it goes a long way to realize that God has given to different people, different stations in life, different gifts, different material possessions, and whatever you have to, like we say, bloom where you're planted will serve where God has placed you.
Yeah.
In whatever place in life that is. And that will be a place of occupying your heart with joy. And what do you know? We ended on a positive note. It's good.
Yeah.
That's good for Ecclesiastes.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, that's it. Don't get too excited about the positive vibes. He's coming back in chapter 6, going to tell you about some more great evils that he has witnessed. And we're going to get into that next episode. Chad, I'll see you then.
All right. See you then.
Hi, this is Chad Bird. Have you ever felt lost? I don't mean you've dismissed a term, but I mean deeply lost in the challenges of life. My new book, Hitchhiking with Prophets, invites you to catch a ride back to our real home with Jesus. Join me as we sit shotgun with legendary storytellers of old like Abraham, Moses, David, and Isaiah. As each companion tells their story, you'll find that they're all pointing us to be on the lookout for the promised seed, the Messiah. Order your copy today and join me in discovering that despite life's twists and turns, we are never truly lost, but always being led home to Jesus.